The compound wall was made of mud brick, and it was the only thing between her and the open ground to the north, and she was grateful for it in the specific and functional way that soldiers become grateful for walls. She had a 4-inch gash along her left shoulder. A fragment, not a bullet, had found the gap between her body armor and her sleeve when the eastern position opened up, and it had opened the flesh cleanly enough that she had dressed it herself in 40 seconds during a lull she identified and used before anyone else registered. It was there, murder. The dressing was holding. She was not thinking about it. Her left hand maintained position on the decompression needle in Galt's chest. Her right hand held the radio handset. Her voice, when she spoke into it, did not shake. Kowalski, the eastern wall is clear. I have Galt stable, but he needs extract in the next 20 minutes. Do not push north until you confirm the second position. Do you copy? Static. Then Kowalski's voice compressed and hard. Copy. Working on it. Elroy's with Briggs at the south entrance. He's mobile. Keep him there until I say otherwise. She pressed the needle steady, checked Galt's color. It was better than it had been 4 minutes ago, which was all she needed it to be right now. The paper in her left breast pocket crinkled slightly when she shifted her weight. The dismissal order. Signed 2 mornings ago by the man she was currently keeping alive. She had stopped noticing it was there. Her name was Tessa Harlow. She was 26 years old. This is how she got here. She had arrived at FOB Salerno on a Tuesday in late August, offloaded from a CH-47 with her kit bag and her medical pack and a set of orders that she handed to the duty sergeant without expression. The sergeant had looked at the orders, looked at her, looked at the orders again. Corpsman, he said. Yes, Sergeant. Female. She waited. He handed the orders back and pointed toward the eastern row of hooches. Check in with Sergeant Kowalski, third door. She found Kowalski cleaning a rifle on a fold-out table outside his hooch. He was 41 years old, built like a man who had spent 2 decades doing things that were hard on the body and had made peace with that, with a jaw like a shelf and hands that moved over the rifle parts with the automatic efficiency of long habit. He looked up when she stopped in front of him. She handed him her orders. He read them, set the rifle parts down, read them again. You're the new corpsman, he said. Yes, Sergeant. You've been in the field before. Yes, Sergeant. With a recon element. No, Sergeant. This is my first. He nodded slowly in the way that people nod when they have received information that confirms something they already suspected. Gear inspection at 0600. You'll be assigned to the support position during operations until further notice. She understood what that meant. Support position, rear, out of the way. Understood, she said. She picked up her kit bag and went to find her bunk. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, 118 pounds. She had dark hair that she kept tied back so tight it looked painted on, and eyes that most people described later when they tried to explain her to someone who had not met her as serious, not cold, not hard, just serious. The kind of eyes that were always doing math you couldn't see. She had been a hospital corpsman for 4 years, attached for the past 72 hours in transit to a Marine recon element operating out of Salerno in Khost Province, eastern Afghanistan. 8 men, 1 woman. Tessa was the youngest person in the unit by 4 years and the lowest ranking by 2 full grades. She was also, as several members of the element would come to understand too late and too slowly, the most dangerous person in the room. She simply had not been given a reason to demonstrate it yet. The team room held 8 people and a map table when Kowalski ran the first full brief 2 days after Tessa arrived. She sat in the back corner and listened and said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. It was a skill she had developed early and refined over years, the capacity to be present in a room without drawing the room's energy toward her, to absorb information without announcing that she was absorbing it. Staff Sergeant Briggs was 36, built like a complaint, the kind of man who was always slightly too loud for the room he was in. He had been a ranger before he cross-trained, and he carried that identity the way some men carry a sidearm, always present, always slightly displayed. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned to read situations quickly and efficiently, and who had not yet been in a situation that required him to revise his initial reading of Tessa Harlow. At the map table looking at the patrol route, he said it to Kowalski with the directness of a man making a budget argument. They pulled Jenkins for this rotation and replaced him with a corpsman. Jenkins had been a sniper. 12 years in, he had separated 2 months ago due to a knee injury held together with surgical hardware and stubbornness for longer than was medically advisable. That's correct, Kowalski said. So we're minus a shooter and plus a medic. He said it the way an accountant describes a bad quarter. Factual. Disappointed. In a recon element. She's assigned to support, Kowalski said. Briggs looked at Tessa. No offense, he said, which was what people said immediately before saying something offensive. None taken, she said. You're not wrong about the math. She went back to looking at the map. At the end of the table, almost invisible in the way that he had cultivated over 20 years of service, Chief Drummond watched her. He was 44, built out of decades of saying less than he knew, with a permanent quality of watchfulness that some people mistook for slowness. 37 months of combined deployment across 3 different theaters had given him an internal inventory for people, for the gap between what a person displayed and what they actually were. He watched Tessa look at the map and he filed what he saw. Prudhomme was at the far end of the table, quiet, measured, the kind of man who made himself easy to overlook, and had probably decided long ago that this was useful. He was 29, 4 years into his second enlistment, with the specific competence of someone who had figured out exactly what was required and delivered it without theater. He nodded once at Tessa when she came in, which was more acknowledgement than most of the room offered. The third instance of the unit's collective opinion about Tessa was not words. It was a patrol brief the 5th day. When Kowalski got to her assignment support position, maintain comms with base, nobody reacted, which was itself the statement. She was the footnote, the thing that was there in case something went wrong. She wrote her assignment in her notepad. Below it, she sketched in about 30 seconds a clean tactical diagram of the patrol route with 3 alternate egress options marked. Drummond, seated across the table, read the diagram upside down. He said nothing. But he was thinking as the brief concluded, and the room began to clear about the gap between what this unit believed it had received and what it had actually been given. The medical kit in the southeast corner of the team room had been bothering her since day 2. It was the main trauma bag, the one they'd grab first if someone took a serious hit. Good bag, well stocked. But whoever had last replenished it had substituted a standard elastic tourniquet for the cat that should have been in the primary slot. For a femoral artery hit, the kind of bleed that dropped a person in 90 seconds, the cat was the difference between a tourniquet and a prayer. She swapped it on day 2 and said nothing about it. What changed the unit's first opinion about her was Elroy. Private First Class Marcus Elroy was 19 years old, from a small town in Georgia, which he mentioned frequently enough that it had become a kind of ambient fact about him. He was earnest and physically capable in the way of young men who had never yet tested themselves against something they couldn't outlast. Day 7. A movement drill, not a live patrol, heat building by 0900, which in Coast in late August meant already brutal. Tessa watched Elroy through the morning with the peripheral attention she applied to everyone, the ongoing inventory of physical states that had become as automatic as breathing. At 10:40, she noticed 3 things at essentially the same time. His gait had changed. Not dramatically, he wasn't stumbling, but the rhythm was slightly off, a half beat behind the rest of him, the way a clock sounds when it's about to stop. His face had stopped sweating. In 104-degree heat. She was already moving before she had finished the thought. She reached him as he was starting to list to the left, that particular slow lean that looked almost voluntary, like a man deciding to sit down until it became clear that no decision was being made at all. She caught him under the arm. He was heavier than her by 80 pounds, and she was braced, and he did not fall. Elroy, she said, quiet, close. Stay with me. He turned to look at her, and his eyes had that unfocused quality, not confusion exactly, but a delay between input and response several seconds too long. I'm good, he said, the automatic response of young men who are not good. You're not. Sit down. Now, this is not optional. She had him on the ground in 3 seconds. Medical pack open in 5. V-line started in 12. Her hands moved independently of conscious direction, finding the veins, setting the line, beginning the fluids, before her full attention when caught up with what her hands were already doing. Heat stroke, she said to Kowalski, who had walked over. Not exhaustion. His thermoregulation has shut down. Core temperature is probably at 104, 105. He needs cooling and fluids now. He does not get back up until I say so. Kowalski looked at Elroy on the ground, then at Tessa. Do what you need to do, he said. Elroy was stable in 11 minutes, coherent in 20, on his feet in 45. He looked at Tessa when she let him stand with an expression trying to find the right category for what had just happened to him. I didn't feel it coming, he said. You wouldn't, she said. That's the point. She closed her pack, went back to what she'd been doing. Briggs, who had watched the entire sequence, looked at his boots for a long moment. Then he went back to cleaning his rifle. But the set of his shoulders was different than it had been before. Not transformed, just updated. The kind of small adjustment that precedes a larger one. It was the Barrett that gave her away. She walked into the armory at the end of the team's equipment check without fully engaging the part of her brain that managed what her hands did in proximity to certain objects. She had been thinking about something else, the supply run to the vehicle pool, the 2 additional CAT tourniquets she had requisitioned and not yet received. The Barrett M8-2A1 was leaning against the equipment rack at the far end of the room. Someone had brought it in for maintenance, 50 caliber, nearly 5 feet long, 30 pounds unloaded. She saw it the way she saw most things peripherally, first cataloging without effort, and her right hand moved. A small adjustment of the fingers, an unconscious reach that she caught and stopped within half an inch of the rifle's stock. The hand pulled back and dropped to her side. Drummond was behind her. He saw it. The adjustment had been automatic, subconscious. The kind of automatic that came from somewhere specific, somewhere with repetition behind it, somewhere that had been built over years and had not gone away just because she had decided not to use it. He filed it away, said nothing. The dismissal order came on a Thursday morning. Tessa was doing her daily kit check when Kowalski found her. He stood in the doorway of the supply room for a moment before speaking, which was unusual for him. "Harlow, the colonel wants to see you." Lieutenant Colonel Warren Galt's office was a plywood room that was slightly larger than the others, which was the only indicator of rank the physical environment provided. He was 53 years old, gray at the temples, with the kind of stillness that came not from inactivity, but from years of learning to conserve motion for when it mattered. There was a scar along his left wrist that disappeared into his sleeve, old pale, the kind that had been there long enough to become just a feature of the landscape of the man. A single sheet of paper in front of him. Tessa stood at attention. "Corpsman Harlow," he said, "your assignment to this element was made 3 weeks ago at the battalion level based on manning requirements. Your medical qualifications are not in question. Your performance in those areas has been adequate." He chose words carefully, not because he was uncertain of them, but because he considered precision a form of respect. However, this element operates in an environment that requires every member to be capable of full tactical integration. Support roles in our configuration still require a standard of individual combat capability that is based on current assessments not yet met. He picked up a pen. "You'll be reassigned to the medical unit at Salerno, Maine. Your orders will be processed today." He signed the paper. Tessa watched his hand move across the page. The left hand, the one with the scar, rested flat on the desk. She looked at the scar for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at his face. "Yes, sir," she said. Galt looked at her. Something moved briefly behind his eyes, not quite discomfort, but an awareness of something he could not name. She had the quality he thought of a person who knew more than they were saying. He handed her the order. She took it, folded it once, put it in her left breast pocket, saluted, turned, left. Outside his door, in the flat white light of the mid-morning compound, she allowed herself 30 seconds of nothing. She looked at the far wall and let the weight of the paper in her pocket be what it was. Her father would have known what she was thinking. Roy Harlow, Master Sergeant, Force Recon, the kind of man who had moved through dangerous places for 20 years like water moves through rock, not crashing, not fighting the obstacle, just finding the path and following it all the way through. He had taught her to shoot when she was 10 years old. Not to hunt, he had been specific about the distinction. They had started with a .22 at a range outside Lejeune and worked up over 6 years through every caliber and distance he judged her physically ready to handle, to the bolt-action rifles that required a different kind of discipline, the kind less about strength and more about the relationship between your body and the moment before you acted. Breathe in 4 counts, hold 7, release 8, heart rate below 70, let the wind tell you what it knows. He had also taught her field medicine, not from a textbook, from himself. Techniques refined over 2 decades of being the person in the room who had to keep someone alive until they could get somewhere with better resources. Some of it was standard. Some of it had been developed in places that didn't officially exist. She had been pre-med at NCPI State when he died, November 2005, Anbar Province. The official language of the notification was careful and military, and told her almost nothing about the specific shape of his last day. She withdrew from school the following semester and enlisted. Her mother had understood in the way of women who had spent 20 years married to a man who was frequently somewhere else for reasons that were not fully discussable. She understood, and she asked one thing. "Tessa," her mother had said, standing in the kitchen of the house in Jacksonville the day of the enlistment, "promise me something." Tessa had looked at her. "Don't pick up a rifle," her mother said. "You can serve, you can go, but promise me not a rifle. That's not a road that ends anywhere I want to see you. She had promised. She had meant it. She packed her kit in the 12 minutes. The medical pack, which was not small, the personal gear, which was, her sidearm, her notepad, the envelope from her father, which had been in the bottom of her pack for 4 years, folded into a worn rectangle, the paper soft from handling. She did not take it out. She picked up the kit bag, walked toward the vehicle pool. Drummond was leaning against the exterior wall, which was probably not coincidence. He looked at the kit bag. He looked at her face. Reassignment, she said. Salerno, Maine. He nodded slowly. She shifted the pack on her shoulder, began to walk. She was 30 feet away when the radio on the duty station crackled open, and the pattern of voices changed the compression and urgency that she had learned to read before she could see the source. Kowalski's voice. Grid coordinates. The word ambush, which had a specific weight to it, the weight of a word that immediately reorganizes everything around it. She stopped walking. The promise to her mother sat in her chest like a stone. Real, heavy, meant. She picked up the medical pack. Drummond was already at the door. The vehicle was a battered MRAP that smelled of diesel and fine dust. Drummond drove. Tessa sat in the passenger seat with the medical pack between her feet and her hands open on her knees. She was not thinking about the Barrett. She was thinking about Elroy, who had been on that patrol. His femoral pulse that morning had been strong and regular. She had checked him at 0630 and cleared him for the day's movement, which had seemed correct at the time and still seemed correct, but the mind rehearsed these things regardless of logic when the stakes rearranged themselves. After 4 minutes, Drummond said without looking at her, "You've been on a Barrett before." Not a question. "My father owned one. Civilian version. We used it on a range outside Lejeune." "How often?" "Most weekends, from when I was 14 until I was 18. He absorbed this the way he absorbed most information without visible reaction, integrating it into his internal architecture for understanding people. "What was your best distance?" "Clean shot confirmed best conditions. 1,400 meters. The MRAP hit a rut and compensated. And in bad conditions," he said. 1,100, maybe 12 if the wind was readable." He nodded once, the nod of a man updating a calculation. They did not speak again until they could hear the firefight. The compressed, irregular percussion of small arms contact, the kind of sound that carried its own information if you knew how to read it. Sustained, not peaking, not resolved. Drummond brought the MRAP to a stop behind a collapsed wall 200 meters from the kill zone's southern edge. Tessa was out before the engine stopped shaking. She had the medical pack. She had her sidearm. She did not look at the Barrett in the back of the vehicle. Her father's voice somewhere in her memory, quiet and certain. The hand that heals and the hand that protects are the same hand, Tessa. The world just forgets that sometimes. She followed Drummond at a low run along the wall toward Kowalski's position. Kowalski was behind a section of compound wall with 2 other members of the element. He had the specific expression of a man who has been solving a problem for 9 minutes and has run out of immediate solutions. He looked at Drummond, then at Tessa. At her specifically, he paused. "Harlow, you're being reassigned." "Yes, Sergeant." "To Salerno, Maine." "Yes, Sergeant." There was another burst of fire from the northeast, close enough that everyone moved slightly closer to the wall without deciding to. Tessa was already moving past Kowalski toward the man on the ground behind the second section of wall. Elroy, he was conscious. The wound was in his left thigh lateral, and whoever had gotten to him first had applied pressure, but had not gotten a tourniquet on. She was on her knees beside him before she had finished assessing. "Elroy," she said. He turned toward her voice with the particular gratitude of someone waiting for a known quantity in an unknown situation. "Doc," he said, "keep talking. Pain level. 7. Okay." She worked the cat above the wound site, tightened until he made a sound through his teeth. "That goes to 9 for a minute, and then it stabilizes. Don't fight it." "Copy," he said. She checked the wound, heavy bleeding but not arterial. She could tell by the color and the rhythm. The femoral was intact. He was not going to die in the next 10 minutes if she kept pressure on this and got him clear of the direct fire zone. She looked up. Drummond was looking at her with the expression of a man who has already reached a conclusion and is waiting to see if the other person reaches the same one. Kowalski crouched beside them. "Our long gun is down. Prudhomme took it in the opening exchange. He's stable, but he's not shooting. I've got nobody with the range to touch that roofline from any position we can reach." He did not look at Tessa when he said this. He looked at Drummond. Drummond looked at Tessa. She closed the trauma pack. She stayed on her knees for one moment and thought about her mother standing in the kitchen in Jacksonville, the afternoon light through the window above the sink. "Promise me, not a rifle." And her father's voice from further back from a Saturday morning at the range when she was 14 and the world was still a specific size. The hand that heals and the hand that protects are the same hand. The world just forgets that sometimes. She looked at Kowalski. Where is it? He understood immediately. The Barrett was in the MRAP, secured to the rear bench, and he had it out and open on the ground beside her in 90 seconds. She looked at the weapon. 30 pounds, 50 caliber. The civilian version her father had owned had been similar in weight, slightly different in configuration. This was the M82A1 semi-automatic, where the civilian had been bolt action. The fundamentals were the same. The physics were the same. The conversation between the shooter and the weapon, and the air between the muzzle and the target, was the same conversation she had been having since she was 14 years old. She picked it up. The weight was exactly what she remembered. Something in her hands went quiet. She moved to the best available position, a gap in the wall at the northern end of their section, the angle shallow but workable sightline toward the elevated position without full exposure. She set the bipod. She adjusted for her size, which required a specific modification of the standard prone position that her father had taught her when she was 15. It had taken 6 sessions to make it automatic. It was automatic now. Third building from the alley, Kowalski said beside her, northeast corner roofline. 2 shooters. Last confirmed position was left of the water tank at the roof edge. Distance, 750, approximately. Wind, a pause. The fact that she asked it first before anything else shifted something in his expression. From the northwest, 8 to 12 knots, not consistent. She settled into the stock, eye to the scope. The roofline came into resolution, pale mud brick, the rounded edge of a water tank, the flat hard light of late morning. She found the left edge of the tank, held. Her breathing slowed. 4 counts in, 7 held, 8 out. She had done this 10,000 times. In rain and wind and cold that made the trigger feel like ice and heat that made the scope shimmer. She had done it with her father standing 6 feet to her right, saying nothing because by the time she was 16, he had understood that the best thing he could give her was silence and trust, and those were the things she ran on. She found the position, left of the tank, a shape that was not the wall. She adjusted for wind, for angle, for bullet drop at this distance with this caliber. She pressed the trigger. The recoil drove back through her shoulder, enormous, real, the kind of force that required the whole body to absorb, or it would find the weakest point and break it. She had been braced. She took it. She came back to the scope. The shape had not moved. She breathed, adjusted. 3 clicks right, half a mil down. The wind had shifted in the moment of the shot. She had felt it on the left side of her face as she pressed the trigger, which meant the round had carried slightly left of the correction she had built in. She found the position again. Pressed the trigger. The shape dropped behind the wall and did not come back up. She stayed in the scope. Watched the space where the shape had been. 8 seconds. 12. 15. Nothing moved. She shifted right. Found the second position further along the roofline, partially concealed behind a raised parapet. The second shooter had pulled back. She could see the edge of a barrel. Just the barrel, 6 inches of it extending past the corner of the parapet. She held. The barrel moved, adjusting, searching, and in the moment of adjustment, the shoulder came into frame behind the parapet's edge. She pressed the trigger. The barrel dropped. Did not come back up. 30 more seconds in the scope, scanning left to right. Nothing moved. She came out of the position, stood up. Kowalski was looking at her. Drummond was looking at her. Briggs, who had come around the wall from the southern position, was looking at her. The compound was very quiet in the specific way that follows sustained gunfire when the gunfire stops. Briggs said it before he had made a decision to say it, not loudly. What was that? 750 meters, she said, approximately. You missed the first shot. Wind shifted. I adjusted. He looked at Drummond. Drummond's expression had not changed, which somehow disturbed Briggs more than if it had. Kowalski said, his voice even. Harlow, where did you learn to shoot? My father taught me. What was your father? Marine Force Recon, Master Sergeant. She paused. Roy Harlow. The name produced no reaction in Kowalski. Roy Harlow had been dead for 5 years, and the institutional memory of specific people did not persist the way families sometimes believed it did. But Drummond went still. Not the stillness of no reaction. The stillness of a man who has heard a name connect to something he had not expected and is holding that connection very carefully while he determines what it means. Tessa did not see this. She had already turned back to Elroy. They extracted the full element in 20 minutes. Two wounded Elroy and Prudhomme, both stable, both moving under their own power with assistance by the time the MRAP reached Salerno's eastern gate. She managed both of them simultaneously, triaging, prioritizing, moving between them with the quiet efficiency of someone solving equations that had a specific answer requiring only correct execution. On the drive back, Kowalski sat in the front and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said to Drummond, "What do you know about her file?" "Why?" "Because I pulled it this morning. 4 years of service, and there's almost nothing in it. Basic training records, corpsman school, one deployment notation from a unit in Lejeune with almost no detail. And then she shows up here." He looked at the side of Drummond's face. "That's not a normal file." "No," Drummond said. "It's not. You know something about it." A long enough pause to be an answer. "I know someone pulled documentation from her service record before she arrived here. I don't know who authorized it. I found out 2 days ago." "Why would someone do that?" "That's the right question." From the cargo area, Tessa's voice, low and even, said something that settled Elroy. Kowalski listened to it without turning around. "She doesn't know," he said. "She knows her file is thin," Drummond said. "She hasn't said anything about it, but she knows." The MRAP rolled through Salerno's gate and into the flat afternoon light of the compound, and they did not speak again until they stopped. The debrief happened at 1600. Tessa was not invited. She was still officially processed for reassignment, the order not yet rescinded. She was in the medical bay doing her write-ups on Elroy and Prudhomme when Drummond came in. He sat across from her. He put a folder on the table between them. He did not open it immediately. He had put in a records request 4 days after she arrived, not for her file, which he had already seen was thin, but for Galt's medical history, specifically the incident documentation from the 2008 administrative period. He had a contact in the JAG office at Lejeune who had owed him a favor since 2006. The form had come through that morning before the ambush, before everything else, and he had been carrying it in his jacket ever since. She looked at the folder, then at him. "This is going to be a long conversation," he said. "It doesn't have to be." She said, "I can give you the short version." He waited. "My father's service record was the one that was supposed to be classified," she said. "Parts of it. Operations in Anbar in 2004 and 2005. Things he was involved in that didn't get written down in ways that are available. Somebody pulled documentation from my file because they saw his name in my background and got nervous." She set her pen down. "I've known this since my second week here. I didn't do anything about it because it didn't change what I was there to do." "How long have you known about the classified portions of his record?" "Since he died. He left me letters. Several, actually. He was very organized about it. Soldiers like him who do the kinds of things he did, they know the paperwork will be incomplete. So they write their own." She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out a worn rectangle of paper folded into eighths, the creases so deep they had become translucent. She unfolded it, set it on the table between them. It was handwritten. The handwriting precise and slightly angular, the kind that suggested a person who had spent a great deal of time writing in the field where care was an act of discipline. She did not read it aloud. She turned it to face him. He read it. The letter covered 3 things. The first was an acknowledgement that she would likely end up in uniform, regardless of what anyone told her, because she was his daughter, and he had accepted this with something the letter described without sentimentality as pride. The second was an account limited in specifics, clear in outline of the things he had done in his final deployment that would not appear in any standard service record and why they had been necessary. The third was a single paragraph. It said, "I taught you to heal because that is the first obligation. I taught you to shoot because healing is not always possible without it. The world will try to make you choose one or the other because that is simpler for the world. Do not let it. Cling to both. There will be a moment when someone is alive because you refuse to be only one thing. That is the moment this was all for." Both hands, Tessa. Always both hands. Drummond read the paragraph, read it again. He folded the letter carefully and slid it back across the table. Then he opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet, a personnel action form, older, the formatting slightly different from current documents. He turned it to face her. She read it. Lieutenant Colonel Warren Galt, Casualty Action Report, April 2008, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Medical incident, cardiac event, left wrist fracture from prior service injury, acute presentation at administrative function. Treated on-site by unidentified civilian staff prior to emergency medical services arrival. Full cardiac event averted. She looked up at Drummond. He was watching her. She looked back at the form, at the date, April 2008. She had been 24. Working 2 jobs, corpsman school tuition was manageable on an E4 salary only if you were creative about supplemental income. One of those jobs had been service work at the Officers Club at Lejeune, the kind of work that was invisible and necessary and paid in cash. She remembered the night, a formal event, a man she had not known the name of going down between one moment and the next, the specific quality of it, the way his weight shifted before he fell, which she had seen from across the room, and started moving toward before she was aware of making a decision. Her training had taken over. 8 minutes of CPR and improvised intervention before the paramedics arrived. The base administrator had asked the event staff to clear out before the press arrived. She had cleared out. She had not known the man's name. She looked at the form, at the name. Warren Galt. She sat very still. He's been trying to find out who helped him that night for 2 years, Drummond said quietly. The event log listed the medical intervention as provided by unidentified staff. He hit a dead end. A pause. He doesn't know it was you. The compound sounds came in from outside vehicles, generators, distant radio traffic. All of it indifferent. She thought about her father, who had also saved a life without a name attached to it, who had done the right thing in a place that didn't officially exist for a man who didn't fully know who he was thanking and had come home and said nothing about it because that was simply what you did. Does he need to know, she said. Drummond considered this carefully. There's more, he said. She waited. Roy Harlow, he said. Anbar Province, November 2005. She went very still. I was there, Drummond said. Not in his unit, adjacent, liaison element. I was at the compound when they brought in Galt. He looked at the table, then at her. Your father held that compound for 40 minutes. 8 people taking heavy contact, no air support, because the weather had closed the corridor. Every decision he made for 40 minutes was the reason Galt came out breathing. He paused. The report that came out of it classified most of the operational detail. Your father's name appears in 2 places in the official record. 2 out of 40 minutes of action that should have filled 20 pages. She listened to this with her face unchanged, but her hands flat on the table pressed down slightly harder. He died in that same deployment, Drummond said. 3 weeks later, she said, yes. Galt knows Roy Harlow's name from the official report. 2 lines. He knows someone by that name contributed to the action. He doesn't know what your father actually did. He doesn't know the scope of it. And he doesn't know I'm Roy Harlow's daughter, she said. He doesn't know who you are at all, Drummond said. Not yet. The afternoon light through the medical bay's single window had moved since they sat down. It was later than she had realized. She thought about a man who had signed a paper that morning while looking past her face through the efficient administrative removal of a person who was to him a category rather than an individual. She thought about the same man carrying a scar on his left wrist from a night in Anbar Province, probably spending some part of every year since trying to understand who he owed and how to repay a debt whose full dimensions he had never been given. She stood up, picked up the medical pack. Tell Kowalski I'm available for duty until the transport comes, she said. The transport isn't coming today, Drummond said. Scheduling changed while we were in the field. Tomorrow then? Probably, she nodded, picked up her pen, went back to her write-up. He said as he stood to leave, your father would have been the same way. Wouldn't have said a word more than necessary. Would have just picked up the pen and gone back to work. She did not look up. I know, she said. The second shot came the following morning. A reconnaissance movement to verify the previous day's position, confirm the roofline clear, gather information for the after-action. Kowalski, Drummond, Briggs, 2 others, and Tessa included without discussion, as if the conversation about her reassignment had passed into a category of provisional things that nobody was ready to finalize. The confirmation sweep went uneventful for 40 minutes. Then Kowalski's radio chirped a second position, identified 800 meters north of the previous day's ambush site, possible active observation post. She was already adjusted to the scope before he finished asking. The conditions were worse. Wind from the northeast 11 to 15 knots, and inconsistent, the kind that changed character between the moment of correction and the moment of the round's arrival. Her shoulder, where the fragment had opened the gash the previous day, had been dressed and was not bleeding, but the muscle had stiffened overnight, and the position she needed to assume compressed that exact muscle group in a way that was specific and considerable. She breathed through it. 1,100 meters. Not the 1,400 of her best confirmed distance, but close enough to the upper range of reliable that it required the full inventory of what she knew. Wind drift calculation, bullet drop at distance. The Coriolis effect at this latitude small but present. She accounted for it the way her father had taught her, not because it would make a decisive difference at this range, but because the habit of accounting for everything was its own form of discipline. She found the position, held. The wind shifted, she adjusted, pressed. The figure at the observation post dropped. She came out of the scope. Her shoulder was reporting loudly, but she had already made the decision not to give that information priority. Briggs was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. No admiration exactly. He was not a man who moved quickly to admiration. It was the expression of someone undergoing a recalibration. The systematic replacement of one set of certainties with another, occurring in real time without pleasure, but with a kind of reluctant integrity. 1,100 meters, he said, in this wind, with that shoulder. She said nothing. That wasn't luck, he said. No, she said, it wasn't. He looked at the ground for a moment, something working in his jaw. Then he looked up. Harlow, I owe you an apology. Not for today, for how I read you from the start. I made up my mind about what you were before I knew anything about you, and I was wrong. When this is done back at Salerno, I want to say it properly. She held his gaze and gave him a single nod, the kind that meant, I received what you said, and we will not discuss it further right now because there is work to do. He nodded back. They went back to the sweep. Drummond behind them watched the exchange and said nothing, but the set of his shoulders had changed, not looser, more settled, like a man who has been waiting for something to become clear, and it has finally done so. The mission brief came at 0500. Tessa was already awake when it started. She had been awake since 0330, which was not unusual in forward positions. Her body remained perpetually on call, as if sleep were something she permitted in portions rather than surrendered to. Her father had been the same way. Her mother had described it once not unkindly as the occupational condition of people who had decided the world needed watching. She sat in the back of the briefing room and listened to Kowalski lay out the operation. The target was a compound 6 kilometers northwest of Salerno, in a valley corridor used for insurgent supply movement for the better part of 2 years. Intelligence had confirmed a coordination meeting scheduled for that morning, multiple principals, a window of approximately 4 hours before the group dispersed. The objective was observation and documentation with interdiction authority if the situation required it. 8-man element, movement at first light. She looked at the map. She had a precise memory for terrain. Her father had developed this in her deliberately, the capacity to hold a physical space in her mind and rotate it and understand it from angles she had not yet physically occupied. The valley had 2 natural choke points and 1 elevated position to the east that commanded the entire approach corridor. She noted all 3 without writing them down. Kowalski looked at her across the room at the end of the brief. Harlow, you're with us. The dismissal order was still in her left breast pocket. Nobody had said anything about it since the previous afternoon. She understood that the military's administrative processes and its operational realities were 2 systems that frequently operated on different schedules, and that the people in this room had made a collective decision, without formal discussion, to let the discrepancy exist until the situation resolved it. She picked up her pack. Yes, Sergeant, she said. They moved out at 06:15 into a morning that was gray at the edges and cold, the temperature sitting somewhere in the low 50s with a wind from the northwest that would warm as the day developed but hadn't yet. 2 columns along the valley floor using the terrain features for cover, the way the terrain intended if you read it correctly, which Kowalski did. Tessa moved in the second position of the left column behind Drummond ahead of Briggs. Briggs moved behind her in silence that had a different texture than before. Not absence, something more like attention. The compound came into view at 7:48, stone and mud brick, a central structure with 2 outbuildings, a wall on the eastern side partially collapsed and reinforced with timber and corrugated metal, vehicle tracks in the soft ground to the south. Recent. The intelligence had been correct. Kowalski set them into observation positions along the ridge that overlooked the compound from the northeast. Standard setup. Tessa was assigned to a position 20 meters behind the main line, close enough to respond far enough back not to be the first person hit if things went loud. She set her medical pack beside a rock formation and ran her pre-positioning inventory. Both cats, primary slots. Chest seals, IV kit, hemostatic gauze. She went through it the way musicians run scales, not because she doubted the result, but because the process was a form of discipline, a way of establishing her relationship to the moment before the moment required something of her. The compound below was quiet. At 0912, it stopped being quiet. She heard the first shot before she understood where it had come from, A single crack that in the still air of the valley had a sharpness that domestic sounds never achieved. Then the radio burst open with Kowalski's voice, and then the compound below was suddenly alive in the specific way that compounds become alive when something has gone badly wrong with a plan. The movement team had been positioned on the southern approach for interdiction. They had moved on a principal who attempted to leave early. The contingency protocols had partially worked. Galt was down. She heard this on the radio in the same second that she was already moving the medical pack swinging onto her back, her body calculating route and speed and cover, before her conscious mind had fully framed the problem. Drummond's voice on the radio position south of the compound wall, 2 men down, one critical. Critical meant something specific. It was not a word used loosely here. It meant the margin was narrow and the timeline was immediate, and something needed to happen in the next several minutes or the margin would close. She came around the southern end of the ridge at a low run, using the collapsed wall section for cover, and found the position. Galt was on his back behind the compound wall. Prudhomme was applying pressure to a wound in his chest with both hands, correct technique, but insufficient, the situation developing faster than manual pressure could address. She dropped beside them. One look told her everything she needed. Entry wound left chest lateral, consistent with a round that came from the western angle during the initial exchange. His breathing was wrong. She heard it before she touched him, the particular quality of a chest not moving air, the way it was designed to one side working and one side not, the breath shallow and rapid, and the color of his lips already beginning to shift. Tension pneumothorax, air accumulating in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, beginning to shift the mediastinum. She had seen it twice in training and once in the field, and the pathophysiology was clear in her mind, the way a road is clear when you have driven it in daylight, every turn known, every decision made before you reach it. 2 minutes, perhaps 3. After that, the pressure on the heart would reach a threshold that would not be reversible in the field. "Move your hands," she said to Prudhomme, not harshly, clearly. He moved. She had the chest seal out. The wound was anterior enough to seal the first thing she needed to confirm, and it was. She sealed it. Then she reached into the pack for the needle, 14 gauge, 3.5 inch, the decompression needle, and she found the second intercostal space mid-clavicular line, the position so precisely defined in her training that her fingers went to it without searching. A single clean motion. The air hissed out. Galt's next breath was different. Not fully corrected, he would need a chest tube, a surgical team resources not available in a compound valley and coast province, but different. The pressure had released. The heart had room. He was in the next 2 hours instead of the next 2 minutes. She was monitoring her left hand maintaining position on the decompression needle when she heard Drummond's voice behind her, very controlled. "Harlow, east wall, shooter, 40 meters. She finished the breath count 1, 2, 3, 4 adequate and confirmed Galt's pulse under her right hand. Then she looked up. The shooter was on the remains of the east wall, partially exposed, the rifle swinging toward the cluster of people at the compound's southern interior. 40 meters. At 40 meters, this was not a precision problem. This was a reaction problem. She looked at Drummond. He had the Barrett. He had been carrying it on the movement because the valley terrain favored long engagement. But Drummond was a competent shooter, not a trained sniper, and the angle between where he was and where the shooter was required a movement that would cost time they did not have. She was already in a different position. Lower. The angle was better from where she was. She took the Barrett from Drummond with her right hand. Her left hand stayed on the needle. There was no protocol for this, no manual entry, no assessment rubric. It was simply the problem as it existed and the tools she had and the time available, which was shrinking. She settled the stock against her right shoulder. Left elbow to the ground, the needle angled correctly, her left hand maintaining the position required to keep the decompression effective. Her right hand worked the weapon, adjusting, finding the position scope unnecessary at this distance. Iron sights, point of aim, point of impact. She breathed. The shooter moved. She tracked. She pressed the trigger. The figure dropped behind the wall and did not come back up. She held position. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing moved on the east wall. She set the Barrett down. Both hands went back to Galt. The compound had gone quiet in the specific way of places where a great deal of sound has just stopped all at once. She heard Briggs say from somewhere behind her, in a voice that had no performance in it, "Both hands." She did not respond. She was monitoring Galt's breathing, counting, assessing the calculation of his next 10 minutes running continuously in the part of her mind that did not stop for anything. He was conscious. She had not been certain of this until his eyes moved toward her face, finding her with the particular effort of a person coming back from the far edge of themselves. Stay still, she said. Pneumothorax. I've decompressed it, but you need to stay still and breathe slowly. You understand? His lips moved. Yes. Very quiet. She watched his chest, counted breaths. His color was improving. She reached forward to adjust the chest seal and her jacket shifted, and the name tape on her chest came into his line of sight. He read it. She saw his eyes stop. Harlow. The letters arranged in the specific order he had written in his own handwriting, in the subject line of a letter of condolence sent to a family in Jacksonville, North Carolina, in December of 2005. The letters that appeared twice in an official report that had classified the most important things about the man to whom those letters had belonged. His voice barely above breath. Harlow. She looked at him. Your father, he said, not a question. He could see it in the eyes, in the structure of the face, in something less specific than either of those things, the quality of a person made by a particular other person over a long time. Yes, sir, she said. He closed his eyes for a moment, opened them. The thing that passed across his face was complicated, and she did not try to name it. He saved my life, Galt said. Anbar, 2005. I know. I wrote the report. His breathing was working now, the rhythm better. 2 lines. It should have been 20 pages. But the classification level required. He stopped. Something in his jaw tightened. It was inadequate. I knew it was inadequate. She was checking the chest seal, doing the work while he spoke. Camp Lejeune, he said, in 2008. She looked at him, met his eyes directly. Yes, sir. He held her gaze for a long moment. The things that moved in his expression were not small things, but he was a man who had spent 30 years managing large things within a contained exterior, and the containment held. What came through was not sentiment. It was the adjustment of a man whose understanding of his own history has just been fundamentally revised. I signed your dismissal order, he said. Yes, sir. He absorbed this, the full geometry of the last 2 days arranging itself into its actual shape. Harlow, he said. Sir, you have the worst luck in the United States military. It was the last thing she expected him to say. Something moved in her face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. I've been told that, sir, she said. His chest rose and fell. Rose and fell, the rhythm was holding. Stay still, she said, and went back to monitoring. The QRF arrived at 10:47. Galt was stable, secured to a litter, his breathing steady and his color close to normal. She briefed the flight medic in 45 seconds. Wound location intervention, performed current vitals. The chest seal's slight adhesion issue on the inferior border. Watch points for the next 30 minutes in the clip-specific language of someone transferring responsibility for a patient they have kept alive and intend to keep alive through the handoff. The flight medic listened with the attention of someone receiving actually useful information. Clean decompression, he said. Yes. One-handed, she looked at him. Does it matter? He looked at Galt on the litter, back at her. No, he said. I guess it doesn't. The helicopter lifted. She stood in the compound and watched it clear the valley's eastern ridge and become a diminishing shape against the pale morning sky and then become nothing. Briggs came to stand beside her. He waited until the helicopter was gone and the compound had settled into its after-action quiet. I want to say it now, he said. What I said I would say when we were back. I think here counts. She waited. I came into this with a fixed idea about what you were, he said, and he said it the way he did things in the field, directly, without decoration. I didn't look at you. I looked at the category I had already put you in, and I let the category do all the work. That was lazy, and it was wrong, and people could have been hurt because of it. He looked at her. I've been wrong about people before. I've been slow to admit it. I'm not going to be slow about it this time. I was wrong, I'm sorry. She held his gaze. His face had the quality of a man who has put something down that he has been carrying at the wrong angle for too long, and the relief of having set it down correctly was mixed with the recognition of how long it had been mishandled. Apology accepted, she said. They stood beside each other for another moment. Nothing more needed to be said. Drummond found the email chain that afternoon back at Salerno, tracking the administrative origin of the reassignment order so it could be properly rescinded. He was not looking for what he found. He found it because administrative paper trails, when followed far enough, lead to the person who made the first decision, and the first decision in this case had not been made by anyone in Galt's element. He brought it to Kowalski. Kowalski read it again, set it down. The chain went back 9 months to before Tessa had been assigned to the element. A request for personnel records initiated by a major in the battalion's administrative office, framed as routine security screening. The response had flagged Tessa's file because of her father's name, Roy Harlow, whose partial record intersected with classified operational files that the record system had a standing alert on. The major had written an internal memo recommending against assignment of Corpsman Harlow to recon elements due to, in his language, uncertainty regarding family background and potential for operational complexity. The memo had no specific evidence, no incident report, nothing except the reasoning that the daughter of a man who had done classified things might, by virtue of that association, be a source of difficulty. It had traveled up the chain and been incorporated into the assessment that reached Briggs as a briefing note characterizing Tessa as a marginal fit for the element. Briggs had taken the characterization at face value. Kowalski had seen the same note and made the same assumption. The characterization had never been based on her performance. It had been based on her father's name and the discomfort of someone who did not want that name in proximity to files he was responsible for protecting. Kowalski sat with this for a long time. He thought about the Barrett at 750 meters in contact conditions. He thought about Elroy's color returning under 12 minutes of correct field intervention. He thought about the decompression needle held in position with her left hand while her right hand handled the weapon. He thought about 3 weeks of quiet professionalism met with the ambient dismissal of a unit that had already decided what she was before she arrived. He thought about her face when she received the dismissal order, the way she had folded it once and put it in her pocket and said, "Yes, sir," and turned and walked out without a word more than was required. He picked up the email chain and went to find Galt. Galt was in the medical bay at Salerno, Maine, sitting up when Kowalski came in, and men who sat up were managing their situation rather than being managed by it. He looked at the email chain for a long time. Then she knew. She told Drummond she had known since the second week, Kowalski said. The file was thin enough that she understood something had been done to it. She knew, and she said nothing. "No, sir." Galt set the chain on the bed. He looked at the wall. "Who wrote the memo?" he said. "Major Caldwell, battalion admin." "Pull his reassignment paperwork. I'll review his file personally." A pause. "I want a personnel action form, formal reinstatement. Corpsman Harlow assigned to this element effective immediately, the dismissal order voided. And I want her record corrected, everything removed, I want it restored. If the records office needs authorization above my level, I will make those calls personally." "Yes, sir." "One more thing." He looked at Kowalski directly. "There is a commendation package in my field desk. It's been there for 6 years, addressed to the family of Master Sergeant Roy Harlow. I've been trying to find a current address for 6 years. The original address I had was a house in Jacksonville that the family had left." Something moved in his face and was contained. "I know where the family is now." Kowalski understood without being told anything more. He nodded once. "Bring Harlow here," Galt said. "This evening." She came at 1800. Drummond walked her to the door and did not follow her in. Some conversations required only one person and a closed door. Galt was sitting up, the field desk open beside him, a form on the bed, and something else beside it, smaller, in a velvet presentation case worn at the corners from handling. She stood just inside the door. "Sit down, Harlow," he said. She sat in the chair beside the bed. "I've spoken to Kowalski," he said. "There is a personnel action form here that reinstates your assignment to the element and voids the dismissal order. The file removal is being addressed at the records level. None of that is a favor. All of it is a correction of things that should not have happened." She looked at the form. "Yes, sir." "I want to say something else," he said. "Something that is not administrative." He picked up the velvet case. He held it for a moment before he opened it in the way of someone who has held a thing many times and is aware of its weight, which is not only physical. He opened it. A bronze star medal. The bronze 5-pointed star on the ribbon. The citation card in his handwriting. She recognized it as the same hand that had been on the condolence letter her mother had kept in the box in the closet of the house they moved to after Jacksonville. "Your father was recommended for this," Galt said. The recommendation went up the chain and was held at the classification level of the operation. He never received it. He set the case on the bed between them. "I requested a posthumous authorization 2 years ago. It was approved 8 months ago. I have been carrying this since then, trying to find you." She knew about the Bronze Star recommendation. Her father's letter had mentioned it briefly, characteristically, in the way he mentioned things that had to do with his own recognition, which was with a kind of wry distance from the subject, as if honors were things that happened to a different person who happened to share his name. He had written, "They're recommending me for something. I imagine it'll get lost somewhere in the paperwork, which is fine. The work was the point. She picked up the medal. It was heavier than she had expected. Or perhaps she had known exactly how heavy it was, and the expectation of the moment had arranged itself around the weight rather than the other way. She turned it over, the citation card in Galt's handwriting for actions in Anbar Province, November 2005. Master Sergeant Roy Patch Harlow, USMC, service above and beyond. Given with the full understanding that words are insufficient. The last sentence was not standard citation language. It was his. She held the medal for a long time. Galt watched her without speaking, which was the right thing to do. When she looked up, her face was what it had always been composed, the serious eyes that did math you couldn't see. But something beneath the composition had shifted very slightly. The way a foundation shifts when a heavy thing has been set down correctly after a long time carried at the wrong angle. He would have made a joke, she said, about the paperwork. Galt's face changed, the precise control of it relaxed just slightly around the eyes. He did make a joke. On the radio before the extract. I was barely conscious. I remember it. She almost smiled. He had a lot of them. Most of them were bad. That sounds right, Galt said. They sat in the particular quiet of two people sharing a loss that is shaped differently for each of them, but occupies the same space. She closed her hand around the medal. Thank you, sir, she said. He shook his head, slightly. The debt is mine, has been for a long time. He looked at her directly. He saved my life in the 2005. You saved it twice more, 2008 and today. I want you to understand that I am aware of what that means, not administratively. What it means. She met his eyes. I understand, sir, she said. He nodded. She stood. She held the metal case in both hands. Kowalski was in the corridor when she came out. Drummond was there. And Briggs, who must have known where she would be, who had come without announcement and was standing with his hands at his sides in the posture of a man waiting to do something he intends to do properly. She looked at all three of them. Kowalski came to attention. His right hand came up. A salute precise and held. She stood for a moment. Then she stood at attention and returned it. Briggs did not salute. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and when he let go, he looked at her with the expression of a man who has finally put a word to something that has been wordless for days. He said nothing. She said nothing. Some things had already been said and did not need to be said again. She looked at Drummond. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has been watching something develop from its beginning and is satisfied with how it ended. She nodded back. She walked down the corridor past the operations center, in the comms shack, in the supply room where she had swapped the tourniquet 3 weeks ago, without saying anything, out into the evening air of FOB Salerno. The sky over Coast Province at dusk was a deep and specific blue, the kind of blue that only existed at altitude at the margins of the day, in places that were very far from anywhere else. She stood in it for a moment. She had promised her mother she would not pick up a rifle. She thought about that promise now. Not with guilt exactly, but with the recognition that promises made from love are sometimes in tension with obligations that come from the same place, and that living with that tension was not a failure but a feature of being a person who had decided to take both things seriously. Her father had known this. He had written it in his angular, careful handwriting, in the letter that was now folded back in her jacket pocket. There will be a moment when someone is alive because you refuse to be only one thing. She had not known when she first read that sentence that the someone would be the man who signed her dismissal order. She thought her father would have found this darkly amusing. She thought he would have told the story badly on purpose and watched people try to figure out whether to laugh. She pressed her hand briefly against her jacket pocket where the metal case was, then she went back inside. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, March 2011. The classroom was a converted briefing room in the medical training annex, map brackets still on the walls, electrical conduit running to positions where screens had once been mounted. Now it held 16 chairs in a loose semicircle, a whiteboard, and a long table with 2 field medical kits laid out open for inspection. 16 students, corpsmen and medics, a mix of ratings and grades. The youngest was 21. The oldest was 33. Several had recent deployment experience. Several had not yet deployed. They were all looking at the woman at the front of the room. She was 26 years old, 5'4". Her shoulder had healed to the point where it no longer reported to her unless she asked it something specific. The circles under her eyes that had been present for most of the autumn were gone. She had put back the 6 pounds she had lost during the coast rotation, which her body had needed, and her appetite had eventually cooperated with. She stood at the front of the room beside the open medical kits. "We are going to spend the next 12 weeks on a single idea," she said. "The idea is integration. It is not a complicated idea, but it is one that most training frameworks resist because training frameworks are built around categories. And integration is by definition the refusal of categories." She paused. "You are being trained as medics. You will think of yourselves as medics. That is correct. But in the environments where you will apply that training, you will encounter moments when the medical problem and the tactical problem are the same problem occurring at the same time, and the person who can only do one thing will not be able to solve it." She picked up the cat from the left kit. "This is the first thing we will know completely. The mechanics, the application, the failure modes, the conditions under which a standard tourniquet is insufficient, and what you do instead." She set it down. "Then we are going to the range, and you are going to learn what your hands can do when they are required to do more than one thing." A student in the front row 23, attentive with the specific look of someone already organizing what she heard into internal categories, raised her hand. "Ma'am, will we be qualifying on specific platforms?" "We will be qualifying on the principles," Tessa said. "The platform is secondary. The principle is that your hands know what they're doing regardless of what they're holding." She looked at the student. "What's your name?" "Corpsman Reeves, ma'am." "Reeves, have you deployed?" "No, ma'am. Orders for Camp Pendleton after this course." Tessa looked at her for a moment. The particular quality of alertness that wanted to be competence and hadn't yet had the chance to become it. "Then you will learn it here," she said, "so that the first time you need it, you've already done it." She turned to the whiteboard. She wrote 2 words. "Both hands." She looked at the 16 people looking at her. "Everything else," she said, "is detail." That evening, she sat in the small office assigned to her for the duration of the course and called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring. Answering on the first communicated anxiety, and her mother did not allow herself to communicate anxiety about things she could not control. The second ring was composure. It always had been. "Tessa," her mother's voice unchanged by distance or time or years of receiving phone calls that could have carried any news at all. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" "Good. The course started today. 16 students. Are they attentive?" "One asked a good question in the first 10 minutes. That's a reasonable indicator." Her mother made the small sound that meant she was smiling without choosing to display it. "You sound like him when you say things like that." Tessa was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she said, "do you remember you made me promise something the day I enlisted?" A pause. Her mother's pauses had their own vocabulary. This one meant, "I know what you're going to say, and I have been thinking about how to respond to it for some time." "I remember," her mother said. "I broke it. The part about the rifle. I broke it twice. Once because the situation required it, and there was no one else, and people would have died. And the second time for the same reason." Her mother was quiet. "I should have told you before now," Tessa said. "You're telling me now," her mother said. "I know. I needed to understand how I felt about it first, before I explained it to someone else." "And how do you feel about it?" She looked at the metal case on the desk, at the whiteboard she had brought into the office so she could see the 2 words while she sat here. "I think," she said slowly, "that the promise I made was about keeping myself safe. That what you were really asking was that I not become something consumed by one way of being in the world." She paused. "I think I've done that. I think I'm both things, and that's what he wanted. What he trained me for." Her mother was silent long enough that Tessa counted the seconds. "He told me once," her mother said, "that the thing he worried about was that you would get into the world and let the world tell you which part of yourself to use. He said you know how he was with metaphors. He avoided them whenever possible. But he made an exception. He said it was like training someone to use both hands and then watching the world reach in and tie one behind their back." A breath. "He was proud of you before you'd done anything to be proud of. You should know that. It was just there in him from the time you were small." She pressed her free hand flat on the desk. "I know," she said. "You sound like you're carrying something," her mother said. "I got something of his, that I'll bring when I come home." She looked at the velvet case. "Something he earned," she said. "That should have reached you a long time ago." Her mother understood the way she understood most things that circled around Roy Harlow, which was deeply and quietly and without requiring the specific words. "Come home soon," she said. "I will." She ended the call and sat for a while in the quiet of the office. Outside, Fort Bragg made its ambient sounds, the generators and the distant vehicle movement, and the cadence of a training run somewhere to the north. the caller's voice carrying but the words indistinct. She opened the metal case. She had looked at it many times since Galt placed it in her hands in the medical bay at Salerno. Each time it was the same, the weight, the citation card, in his handwriting, the reverse face with its plain government stamp. And her father's voice reading it to her in her memory without trying, "They're recommending me for something. I imagine it'll get lost somewhere in the paperwork, which is fine. The work was the point. The work was the point." She understood this the way she understood the tourniquet protocol and the decompression procedure, and the moment between the held breath and the pressed trigger completely below the level of conscious decision, in the place where things that have been repeated long enough stop being learned and simply become true. In the morning, there would be 16 people in a room waiting for her to give them something that would matter in places she would not be present to see. That was the work now. Not the individual shots, not the individual lives, not the individual moments of crisis resolved by whoever happened to have the right training at the right time. Those moments were real, and she did not diminish them. But the work now was to make them less rare, to build a wider distribution of the capacity that her father had spent 2 decades distributing through her, systematically, patiently expecting competence and accepting nothing less, but never making her feel small when she fell short. She thought about the range outside Lejeune on a Saturday morning when she was 14, the air smelling of pine and cordite, her father standing 6 feet to her right and saying nothing at all because he had already understood that silence and trust were the most important things he could give her, and those were the things she ran on. She closed the metal case. She set it in her jacket pocket where it would stay until she brought it home. She walked out of the office through the quiet corridor past the classroom with its 16 chairs and its open medical kits and the whiteboard with 2 words on it, and out into the March night. The air was cold and clear. Stars over Fort Bragg, more than you would expect this close to a built environment, visible between the base lighting in the patches of genuine dark. She stood in the cold for a moment with her hands at her sides. Her shoulder was quiet. Her hands were steady. The weight of the metal in her pocket was exactly what it was: not heavy, not light, but specific, real, placed correctly after a long time misplaced, and she had learned it in the past 6 months that this was often the most important part of any reckoning, not the recognition itself, but the accuracy of where it finally landed. Tomorrow the class started at 0600. She had the first question already written on the whiteboard, waiting for 16 people who did not yet know what they were capable of. She did. She turned and went back inside.